Welcome back, everybody. Today we're doing a deep dive on something, well, pretty heavy. The
Yeah,
psychology of racism.
definitely heavy but important.
For sure. And we're really going to focus on how these ideas of like superiority, how do those actually turn into actions and discrimination?
Yeah, how do they manifest
Exactly.
in the real world?
So to help us unpack all of this, we have some excerpts from an academic text that looks at racism from both historical and psychological angles.
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach because
Oh.
you kind of have to look at both sides of the coin.
Totally. And by the end of this deep dive, you're going to have a way better understanding of all the historical context, the psychology behind it.
The mechanisms.
Yeah, and how this impacts all of us even today.
It's like, a crash course on understanding the roots of racism.
I like that, a crash course.
Ah,
So one of the first things that jumped out at me from this text was how much it emphasizes the historical context.
oh, absolutely.
We often talk about racism as like this isolated thing.
In a vacuum.
Yeah, but it's crucial to understand that it's deeply rooted in colonialism and economic exploitation.
It's like we can't just look at the leaves, we have to look at the roots.
Exactly. And you mentioned economic exploitation. Can you expand on that a bit?
Sure. So the source really stresses how the expansion of these European empires was directly tied to the enslavement of African people.
Hmm.
And it wasn't just about like individual prejudice or anything. This was a system like literally designed to create wealth.
Wow.
And this whole system, like the foundation of it, it needed that narrative of superiority and inferiority.
So you're saying we're talking about a system built on the backs of enslaved people,
Mm-hmm.
and it needed to justify that exploitation somehow.
Yeah, and to do that, to make it,
Palatable.
palatable even to themselves, they
Yeah.
turned to some pretty awful tactics.
Like what?
Well, the text mentions Samuel Cartwright and his work on diseases and peculiarities of the Negro race.
Oh, I've heard of that. That's
Yeah.
disturbing stuff.
It's a chilling example of how they used so-called science, pseudoscience,
Right.
to dehumanize and to otherize Black people.
It's almost unthinkable that this kind of science was used to categorize entire groups of people
Yeah,
as inherent different and lesser.
and justify horrible treatment.
It's really unsettling how those historical justifications connect to the psychology we're talking about.
Right.
The source brings up cognitive dissonance, right?
Yes, and it plays a huge role here. Imagine the internal conflict those slaveholders must have felt.
Oh, for sure.
On one hand, these were people who, probably talked about freedom and equality, at least for some.
Right.
But on the other hand, they were actively part of a system that denied those very things to a whole population.
Talk about a contradiction.
That's cognitive dissonance, like
Yeah.
textbook.
So how did they deal with that conflict? Did they all just decide to just abandon those values?
Not necessarily, no. The text says that people tend to resolve that cognitive dissonance in a few different ways. They might actually change their behavior to align with their beliefs. Or they might change their beliefs to align with their behavior. Or they might find ways to justify that difference.
make it okay.
Exactly. And in the case of slaveholders, that justification route, that was the one they often took. And dehumanization, that was a key part of it.
So instead of actually confronting the morality of their actions,
Yeah.
they chose to basically dehumanize enslaved people, convincing themselves that these people were somehow less deserving of basic human rights.
Exactly. And this wasn't just a few people. This thinking became like ingrained in their whole society. It was woven into laws, education, even religion. It created the system where entire populations were seen as less than human.
And that made it easier to exploit them.
Of course, of course.
It's disturbing how readily good people or seemingly good people can become complicit in these oppressive systems.
It really is.
So dehumanization is one way to resolve this cognitive dissonance. Were there other psychological things going on?
Oh, yeah, for sure. The text also digs into social identity theory,
Right.
which helps us understand how people form their sense of self
Yeah.
through the groups they belong to.
Right, makes sense.
It's about that need to belong, to be connected to something bigger than yourself.
For sure.
And unfortunately, in this case, race became a powerful way to define those in-groups and out-groups.
So you're saying that white people in these slaveholding societies formed this identity.
Collective identity.
Yeah, based on race, and that fueled their sense of superiority
Exactly.
over those who were enslaved.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy,
How so?
It's like we are superior because we're part of this group, and because we're superior, we're justified in our actions against those who aren't.
Wow. It's this cycle of justification that's just, it's got to be so hard to break.
It really is. And it's not just about individual beliefs, you know.
Mhm.
The source really emphasizes how these narratives of white superiority, they were like systematically embedded in culture. They were woven into education, religion, even medical practices.
It's almost like
We
this
use
deliberate
metaphors.
attempt to solidify those racial hierarchies.
Yeah, to justify their power.
It's fascinating and horrifying at the same time.
Mhm.
It wasn't just individual prejudice. It was this carefully crafted ideology.
To maintain power and control.
That's why understanding the historical context is so important.
Absolutely.
It helps us see how racism isn't just a personal feeling. It's rooted in these systems and structures.
That still impact us today.
Yeah,
In
absolutely.
ways we might not even realize.
Like peeling back the layers of an onion, the more you learn, the more you realize how deep this stuff goes, these systems of oppression.
Mhm.
But if we're going to actually try to dismantle them, we need to understand how they work, like the nitty-gritty.
The mechanisms.
Yes. And the source actually goes beyond just that broad historical context.
Mhm.
It looks at specific psychological things that help maintain this sense of superiority.
Right.
And one that really stood out to me was scapegoating.
Oh, yeah. Scapegoating. That's a powerful tool to make people feel like they belong and justify discrimination.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. The text uses the example of white slaveholders blaming black people for, when the economy wasn't doing well. Or...
Oh, like social problem.
Exactly.
It was a way to shift blame
Totally.
and hold on to their power.
Keep that status quo.
It was like a distraction, right? Like
Yeah.
instead of dealing with the real issues,
You got it.
you just point at a group that's already marginalized and say it's their fault.
Mm-hmm.
And sadly, it doesn't feel like that tactic has gone away at all.
Oh, no, not at all.
We see it all the time with immigrants, minorities.
Anyone seen as a threat?
Yeah, anyone who is perceived as like,
Different.
different, or a threat to how things are.
Exactly.
It's this way to like stoke fear and resentment,
Oh, for sure.
which then, can be used to justify all these awful policies.
Actions, yeah.
It makes you think, like, how much of this is about actual prejudice, and how much of it is about fear?
Fear and insecurity.
Yes. The source mentions that too, right?
It does,
That
yeah.
fear can actually make those feelings of superiority even stronger.
Oh, absolutely. When people are scared,
Yeah,
they look for ways to protect themselves and their group.
makes sense.
And one way to do that is, by making those distinctions even stronger, the us versus them.
In group, out group
Exactly, which then, of course,
leads to more prejudice.
more prejudice, more discrimination.
So it's not always about just like outright hatred.
Not necessarily.
Sometimes it's about, that feeling of threat, of
Like,
vulnerability.
could be like defensive thing,
Defensive mechanisms, yeah.
which is why it's not enough to just address those individual prejudices.
Right, we have to look deeper.
We have to go after the systems that create these feelings of insecurity.
We got to get to the root of the problem.
That brings us to, I think, a really crucial question.
Okay.
How do we use this knowledge?
Yeah. The historical stuff is important, the psychology, it's all fascinating.
Mm,
But what does it actually mean for us now?
that's the big question.
It is. So what does the source say about that?
Well, it emphasizes education and awareness as that first step.
Okay.
Like, we need to really look at history with a critical eye, challenge those narratives of superiority that have been around for so long.
So it's about understanding the why behind the what, right?
Exactly.
Not just like memorizing dates and names,
Mhm.
but like really grappling with the psychological mechanisms that made these systems possible.
It's about asking those tough questions.
And being aware of our own biases too, right?
Absolutely.
Those little ways that history might still be messing with our thinking.
It's a process of unlearning and then relearning.
Sounds like a lot of work,
It is. It is.
but it's got to be empowering too, right?
It is. It is. When we understand how these systems work,
Yeah.
we can start to break them down.
The source also talks about addressing systemic racism, right?
Yes, that's a huge part of it.
And that's where things get really complicated, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's not just about, what individuals do or don't do.
Mm-hmm.
It's recognizing that racism is literally baked into our institutions, our laws, our policies.
It's in the fabric of our society.
And it's about like dismantling those structures that keep inequality going, even if that wasn't their original intent.
You got it.
So we're talking about like the justice system,
A criminal justice system, for sure.
education, healthcare, housing,
All
these systems that can have such a huge impact on certain communities.
It's proportional.
Exactly. And that takes a willingness to even just acknowledge those disparities.
Admit there's a problem.
Yeah, and then look at what's causing them, and then actually fight for change.
Hmm.
The source mentions something else, too.
What's that?
Intergroup dialogue
Oh, yeah.
as a key part of this.
That's crucial.
Why is that so important?
Well, intergroup dialogue is about making space for these real, honest conversations between people of different backgrounds, racial, ethnic backgrounds,
So like sharing experiences.
and even like pain
Yeah, pain too.
in a way that can build empathy.
And understanding, yeah.
That sounds challenging, but also really rewarding.
It is both of those things.
Do you think it's really possible to bridge those divides just through talking?
It's not a quick fix,
Right.
but the research shows that it can be really powerful when people connect on a human level.
Yeah.
See each other as people.
Yeah.
It starts to chip away at those stereotypes and prejudices.
It's like that saying, people fear what they don't understand. The more we understand each other.
The less we fear each other.
And that feels like a big step towards, actually making a more just and equitable world.
It really does.
And it's not just about changing people's minds, right? It's
Right.
about building relationships
It's about building relationships, making alliances
and working together.
to create real change. This all sounds very hopeful.
Yeah.
But I do have to wonder, is it really possible to get rid of something as deep as racism?
That's a tough one.
It is.
There's no easy answer.
Right,
But the text does offer some hope.
right.
It points out that we have made progress. Things are different now than they were even just a few decades ago.
Oh, for sure.
And that progress, that's because of people and organizations who refuse to accept things the way they were.
Wow, so it's not about reaching some perfect endpoint.
No.
It's about continuously trying to build a better future.
It's a journey,
It is.
a long and complex journey, and we'll mess up along the way, but
But it's worth it.
it is worth it because, the stakes are high,
Oh, yeah, they are.
and we're not alone in this,
Right. There are so many people and groups
fighting for this.
doing this work.
Yeah, and the source reminds us that we all have a role to play,
Totally.
whether it's educating ourselves, challenging our own biases, having those tough conversations, or supporting the organizations doing the work.
We can all do something.
Exactly.
It's empowering to think that even small things can make a difference.
I agree.
But before we go to big picture, I want to come back to something we talked about earlier.
Okay.
The psychological toll of racism,
Oh, yeah.
The source mentions mental health, but it doesn't go into a ton of detail.
That's an important point.
It is. We often focus on the social and political impacts,
Mm-hmm.
but it's so important to acknowledge the impact on mental health.
On everyone.
Yeah, for both victims and perpetrators.
Absolutely.
So what kind of impact are we talking about here?
Well, for victims,
Yeah,
racism can lead to feeling worthless, hopeless, angry.
right.
It can cause anxiety, depression, even PTSD.
Oh, wow.
That constant stress of living in a world that's often hostile, it takes a toll.
Yeah, for sure. And for perpetrators.
Well, it's important to remember that racism isn't just about individual hatred.
Right.
It's about being part of a system
Yeah.
that devalues and dehumanizes entire groups of people.
And that complicity, that can have consequences too.
It can. It can lead to guilt, shame, a sense of moral dissonance.
Wow.
And it can actually perpetuate that cycle of fear and insecurity.
Oh, interesting how.
Well, because individuals become more and more dependent on maintaining those distinctions, that us versus them, to feel safe.
It's like this poison that infects everyone,
Yeah.
even those who think they're immune.
Exactly.
And that's why addressing mental health is so crucial.
So crucial.
We need to create spaces for
Reciprocal
healing,
dialogue, reconciliation.
support for
Excellent,
victims,
absolutely.
and help perpetrators really look at their own biases.
And their complicity.
So it's not just about changing laws.
It's deeper than that.
It's about changing hearts and minds.
It's about empathy, understanding, and ultimately healing.
It feels like we've been going through some really dark and heavy stuff.
It is a heavy topic.
It is, but when you said the thing about healing,
Yeah.
it brought some hope into it.
It's not just about tearing things down.
Yeah, exactly. It's not just about dismantling these systems. It's also about building something better.
Something more human.
Yes. And that rebuilding has to start with acknowledging the pain, right? The trauma that racism has caused to individuals, to whole communities.
We need those stories to be heard.
Yeah, and for those wounds to start to heal.
It's like we're tending to a garden,
Oh, like that.
It's been ignored for too long.
We got to get rid of all the weeds of prejudice and discrimination.
And nourish the soil with empathy.
Yes. And then plant those seeds of justice and equality.
It's a beautiful analogy,
It is
and it reminds us that this is a process,
a constant process.
a labor of love.
So where do we even start? What can we do to cultivate this garden?
Well, the source talks a lot about supporting organizations on the front lines of racial justice.
Okay, yeah.
These are the groups doing the work.
They're providing services to communities that have been hurt by racism.
They're advocating for policy change,
Yeah.
challenging those systems,
So we're talking about actually putting our money where our mouth is.
donating, volunteering, sharing their message.
Yeah, what about on a more personal level? What can we do?
The source also talks about having those tough conversations
yeah.
with family, with friends.
I know, those are never easy.
No, they're not.
But challenging loved ones when they say or do something racist, that's crucial.
It's like holding up a mirror,
Like, hey, look at this. This is what it looks like.
This is how your words are affecting people.
It's not about blame,
No, it's about awareness.
accountability.
And remember, unlearning racism, that's a process for us and for everyone else.
It takes time, education, and a willingness to get uncomfortable.
And patience.
Lots of patience.
With ourselves and with others.
And it's okay to not have all the answers.
Absolutely not. We're all still learning.
We're figuring this out together.
Yeah.
This source doesn't give us a perfect roadmap
No.
for getting rid of racism,
No.
but it does give us this framework
To understand it.
to understand it. Yeah. Its roots, its impact.
And that understanding.
It's powerful.
It's like a key.
To a door we didn't even know was there.
And on the other side of that door is the possibility of a different world.
A world where everyone is safe, respected, valued, no matter their race.
Where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Where racism is just a thing of the past.
A relic.
That's a world worth fighting for. And I think this deep dive, this has given us the tools
And the inspiration.
to join that fight. Before we wrap up, though,
Okay.
I want to touch on something you said earlier
Sure.
about the impact of racism on those who perpetuate it.
Something we don't talk about enough.
Yeah, we focus so much on the harm to victims,
Mm-hmm.
but it's important to remember that racism harms everyone.
It distorts your view. It erodes your empathy. It dehumanizes you.
It's a disease that infects our whole society.
And like any disease, it needs treatment.
And healing.
And that healing starts with awareness.
With recognizing how we've all been impacted by this in different ways.
Individually and together.
This isn't a black issue or a brown issue. It's everyone's issue.
A human issue.
And we all have a responsibility to do something about it.
So as we finish this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question.
Yeah.
How can knowing about the psychology of racism actually help us challenge those everyday prejudices?
It's a question we should all be thinking about.
Yeah.
Because just being aware of racism isn't enough. We have to actively dismantle it.
In our own lives and in the world.
By understanding the psychology, we can start to see those subtle prejudices
Call them out.
work towards a better world.
It's about being mindful, having those hard conversations, and using our voices to make change.
And remembering that even small acts of kindness can ripple out.
Never underestimate the power of one person.
Thank you for joining us on this exploration.
It's been a journey.
We hope you learned some things and feel inspired to keep talking about this.
This is just the start. There's so much more to learn, to do, to discuss.
Keep learning, keep being curious.
Find different perspectives, have those conversations, and use your knowledge to make a difference.
Until next time.